He told me to leave before the ice in my glass melted, and I remember noticing the ceiling fan was spinning backward, slow and steady, like the room itself had decided I didn't belong there anymore. I stood at the edge of the kitchen with my hands resting on the handle of my old metal toolbox, listening to the little clicks of ice against plastic, watching the sweat slide down the cup and pool on the counter. Across from me, Caleb Larkin didn't look angry. That was the part that scared me. He looked practical, like he was returning something he'd borrowed and didn't want to be responsible for anymore. "Don't make this hard, Frank," he said. "Just go." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam a door. I didn't even ask why, not out loud. I'd already felt it coming for weeks, in the way Caleb stopped answering when I spoke, in the way he'd started locking his office door even when he was home, in the way his wife, Tessa, kept busy with dishes that were already clean. The air in that house had changed the way air changes before a storm. You can't see it, but you can taste it. "Caleb," I said quietly, because I still had the habit of using a soft tone with him, the way I had when his mother was alive and everything in our lives was balanced on grief. "I can stay in the back room. I won't be in your way. I'm not asking for much." He finally looked at me then, and his eyes were flat. "You are in the way," he said. "That's the whole problem." Tessa was at the sink, her back turned. She kept scrubbing a pan with the same slow motion over and over, like she was trying to wear a hole through the metal. I watched her shoulders. They were tense, held too high. I wanted her to turn around. I wanted her to say my name. I wanted any sign that I still mattered to someone in that room. "Tessa," I said, "please." The water kept running. The pan kept scraping. Her chin dipped, almost like a nod, but she didn't turn. A second later, she shut the faucet off and walked out of the kitchen without looking at me. I heard the soft thud of their bedroom door closing down the hall. Not a slam, just a quiet ending. Caleb glanced at his phone. 10 minutes, he said, like he was timing a pizza delivery. I stood there for a breath longer than I should have, letting the humiliation settle into my chest. 68 years old, and I was being given a countdown in a house I'd helped pay for when his mother got sick. I'd been the one who covered the deductible when the insurance didn't. I'd been the one who drove her to chemo when Caleb couldn't get off work. I'd been the one who sat beside her at night, listening to her breathing turn shallow, holding her hand until it went still. But none of that had a place in Caleb's face now. In his mind, it was all past tense, useful while it lasted. I walked to the small room off the laundry area, the one they called the guest room, even though it had been my room for almost a year. The closet smelled like dryer sheets and the faint sourness of old carpet. My shirts were still hanging there, buttoned and spaced out neatly. I'd kept them that way because it was the only corner of the house where I still had control over how things looked. I pulled my duffel bag from under the bed and set it on the thin mattress. My hands were steady at first. That surprised me. Then I started putting things in, and the steadiness turned into something else, automatic, practiced, like I'd done this before. 3 work shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, socks, underwear, a flannel jacket with a tear along the cuff, a toothbrush, a comb, my little bottle of arthritis pills. I paused when I reached for the framed photo on the nightstand. It was a picture of Marlene, my late wife, smiling in a way that made her eyes crinkle at the corners. Caleb was next to her, younger, with his arm around her shoulders. I wasn't in the photo. I took it anyway. I slid it into the duffel carefully, face down, like I didn't trust myself to look at her too long. Then I opened the top drawer of the nightstand and pulled out the envelope I kept there. Inside were documents I didn't understand all the way, papers Caleb had told me to sign months earlier. "Just so I can help you with your bills," he'd said. "Easier this way. You're not good with online stuff." At the time, I'd believed him because believing him was simpler than admitting I didn't know what was happening in my own life. I stared at the envelope. I didn't open it. Not yet. I shoved it into the duffel and zipped it closed. When I came back down the hall, Caleb was standing by the front door with his arms crossed. The porch light was on even though the sun was still up, bright Arizona daylight pouring in through the front window. The house smelled like lemon cleaner and air conditioning. It felt like a place you'd show in a real estate listing, not a place a man had lived long enough to leave a dent in the couch cushion. He looked at my duffel and then at the toolbox in my hand. "You don't need that," he said. I stopped. Yes, I do. It's junk, he said. You can buy another one. I almost laughed at that, the casual way he said it. Like a toolbox was a disposable thing, like it didn't contain the last 20 years of my life. That box had a set of wrenches my students had bought me when I retired from teaching auto shop. The handle was worn smooth where my fingers had curled around it day after day. The latch stuck, unless you pressed it just right. I knew that box better than I knew Caleb. It's mine, I said. Caleb's jaw tightened. He stepped aside, holding the door open. Fine, he said. Take your stuff and go. I waited one more second, because I still had that ridiculous hope that Tessa would come back out, or that Caleb's face would soften, or that someone would say, I'm sorry, or at least, are you okay? Nothing happened. Only the ceiling fan, still spinning backward above the entryway, slow and steady. I walked out. The heat hit me like a wall. Even in late October, Phoenix held warmth in its concrete, in its asphalt, in the dry air that never felt like it belonged to your lungs. My shirt clung to my back immediately. I stepped onto the porch and looked back once, just once, because old habits don't die clean. Caleb shut the door. The lock clicked. The porch light went off. I stood there with my duffel bag on one shoulder and my toolbox in the other hand, staring at my own reflection in the dark glass of the door. A man, shaped like a shadow. A man who had become inconvenient. I walked to the curb and sat on the edge of the sidewalk, because my knees weren't interested in pretending anymore. My phone was in my pocket, but it had a cracked screen and barely any charge. I checked my wallet. $11. A library card. A faded business card from a doctor I hadn't seen in years. That was it. For a long time, I just sat there listening to the neighborhood. Sprinklers clicking on, a dog barking in someone's yard, a garage door humming closed. Ordinary sounds from ordinary lives. It was the kind of normal that makes you feel like you're the only person falling apart. I thought about Marlene, about the night she made me promise something in the hospital. She'd been thin by then, her skin almost translucent, her voice so soft I had to lean close to hear it. Take care of Caleb, she'd whispered. He doesn't have anyone else. I'm here, I'd told her. He has me. She'd squeezed my hand like that was enough. I had kept that promise. I had taken care of him in every way I knew how. I'd helped him pay off credit cards when he was drowning. I'd co-signed for the house when his salary wasn't enough. I'd watched his kids when he and Tessa wanted a weekend away. I'd made myself small and quiet in their home because I thought that was what love looked like at the end of a life, being grateful for whatever space you were given. But sitting on that sidewalk, sweating in the late afternoon heat with $11 and a toolbox, I felt something shift. Not anger yet. Anger takes time. What I felt first was clarity, the kind that comes when someone finally says the quiet part out loud. You are in the way. I got up and started walking, because standing still felt worse than moving. I walked with no plan, past manicured lawns and parked cars, past stucco walls and palm trees that looked too clean to be real. The sun drifted lower, and the light turned gold. My shoulders ached from the weight of the duffel. My fingers hurt from gripping the toolbox handle. But I kept walking because if I stopped, I'd have to decide where to go, and I didn't know. By the time the sky started to fade, I reached a strip mall with a grocery store and a payday loan place, and a laundromat. The lights inside the laundromat were harsh and white. I went in because it was cool, and because nobody cared why you were there as long as you didn't cause trouble. I sat on a plastic chair near the wall and watched the dryers spin. The hum of machines was steady, almost soothing. A teenager pushed a cart of clothes past me and didn't look twice. That was the first mercy of the day, being invisible. I took my phone out again and tried to call the one person I thought might answer. It went straight to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. Pride is stupid, but it's stubborn. That's when I noticed something small and strange. On the opposite wall, above the change machine, someone had taped a handwritten note in black marker. If you lost your keys, ask Frank. The paper was yellowed at the corners, like it had been there a long time. I stared at it for a few seconds, not because it made sense, but because it didn't. My name was Frank. I hadn't been here before. I had no idea who wrote it. I looked away and told myself it was nothing. Outside, night settled in. I left the laundromat and sat on the curb again, the heat finally loosening its grip as the air cooled. My stomach growled. $11 would buy a sandwich and a bottle of water, maybe two. It wouldn't buy a motel room. It wouldn't buy a plan. I held the toolbox on my lap and ran my thumb along the dented edge. I thought about the envelope in my duffel, the papers I'd signed without reading. The way Caleb had been so helpful, so calm, so certain, like he was doing me a favor. And in the dark, with the streetlights buzzing overhead, I realized something that made my throat go tight. Caleb hadn't kicked me out because I was in the way. He'd kicked me out because he couldn't afford for me to stay long enough to find out what he'd already done. I didn't sleep that first night so much as fade in and out of it. I stayed on that curb outside the laundromat until the machines inside went quiet and the last car pulled away. The desert air cooled faster than I expected, and I pulled my flannel jacket tighter around my shoulders, using the duffel as a pillow and the toolbox pressed against my chest like something I needed to guard. Every time headlights swept past, I opened my eyes. Every sound felt like it might belong to someone telling me to move along. By morning, my neck was stiff and my mouth tasted like metal. Hunger made itself known before anything else. It wasn't dramatic, just steady and insistent. I counted the $11 again. I went into the grocery store across the lot and bought a loaf of day-old bread and a bottle of water. The cashier didn't look at me twice. I sat outside on a low concrete barrier and ate 2 slices slowly, chewing until they softened enough to swallow without thinking about how dry they were. I didn't have a destination. That was the part I hadn't let myself consider the night before. There was no relative waiting, no spare room across town. Friends thin out over time, especially after retirement, especially after grief rearranges your priorities. The people I'd taught alongside had scattered. Some moved away, some passed on, some simply became names. I remembered when I couldn't sleep. I walked. I carried the toolbox in one hand and slung the duffel over my shoulder, moving through blocks that grew less polished the farther I went. The sidewalks cracked, the landscaping turned sparse. Pawn shops replaced boutiques. I watched people starting their mornings, unlocking storefronts, washing windshields at gas stations, standing in line for coffee. Nobody saw me. I didn't mind that. Being unseen gave me time to think. I thought about Caleb as a boy, 12 years old when I met him, angry, suspicious, protective of his mother in a way that made sense when you realized how much instability he'd grown up with before she met me. I never tried to replace his father. I showed up. That was it. I showed up for school events. I showed him how to change brake pads. I stayed quiet when he yelled and patient when he withdrew. Over time, the edges softened. Not warmth exactly, but cooperation. A kind of working relationship that felt enough like family to build a life around. After Marlene died, he asked me to move in. He said it didn't make sense for me to rattle around alone in that old place. He said it would be good for all of us. I believed him. I sold my house, rolled the equity into helping with theirs, and told myself proximity was the same thing as belonging. By midday, the sun was high and relentless. I found shade behind a convenience store and drank half the water bottle, forcing myself to save the rest. My hands trembled a little, the arthritis flaring as the temperature climbed. I flexed my fingers around the toolbox handle and kept moving. That afternoon, I reached the public library. It wasn't intentional. I just saw the sign and the promise of air conditioning. Inside, the quiet wrapped around me. I sat at a computer terminal and stared at the login screen, unsure what I wanted to search for. Eventually, I typed in local housing listings, cheap rentals, anything that might resemble possibility. The numbers that appeared weren't made for people carrying $11. I logged out and wandered toward today's newspapers on a wooden rack near the entrance. I wasn't looking for anything specific, habit more than purpose. My eyes drifted over headlines about city council decisions and sports scores until a small boxed notice caught my attention. It was printed among public announcements, easy to miss unless you were bored enough to read everything. County lien auction. Seized properties. Minimum bids listed. I leaned closer. Most were parcels of land or structures described in language that suggested they were barely structures at all. One entry mentioned a mobile trailer lot outside Yuma, forfeited for unpaid taxes and environmental violations. Minimum bid $10. Auction date 2 days away. I read it twice. Then again. $10 wasn't a plan. It wasn't shelter. It wasn't even sensible. But it was something defined, something with coordinates and a time attached to it. I wrote the details on a scrap of paper torn from a notebook page someone had left behind on a table. That night I stayed at a bus station downtown, sitting upright on a plastic bench beneath fluorescent lights that never dimmed. I bought a one-way ticket to Yuma the next morning, with most of what I had left. The bread and water lasted me through the ride. The bus hummed across miles of open desert, landscape flattening into endless brown and sunburned yellow. I watched it through the window and tried not to imagine what waited at the other end. Yuma greeted me with dry heat and the smell of dust. I stepped off the bus with my bag and toolbox and walked toward the county office building listed on my paper. The auction room was smaller than I expected, maybe a dozen people seated in folding chairs. Most looked prepared, flipping through folders or tapping on phones. I took a seat in the back. When the listing came up, it was read quickly. The clerk's voice was neutral. Abandoned trailer yard parcel. No utilities guaranteed. Sold as is. Minimum bid $10. Silence followed, the kind that carries judgment. I raised my hand. 10, I said. The clerk glanced at me, then around the room. No one else spoke. The gavel came down softly. It didn't feel triumphant. It felt procedural. Papers were signed. My remaining cash was exchanged. A receipt and location description slid across the counter to me. Just like that, I owned something again. The property sat several miles outside town. I walked most of the distance because I couldn't afford transportation, resting twice beneath highway signs, sweat soaking through my shirt. When I finally reached it, I stopped at the edge of a dirt access road and looked out. It was worse than I'd pictured. Rusted trailers tilted on cracked concrete pads, a skeletal workshop frame with corrugated metal peeling off like scabs, scrap scattered in sun-bleached piles. No movement, no shade, except for the shadow of a leaning water tower that no longer worked. I stepped forward anyway. The ground crunched under my boots. I pushed open the door of the least collapsed trailer and stepped inside. Dust floated in the light. The air smelled of old metal and heat. There was nothing here that resembled comfort. But there were walls. A roof mostly intact. Space. I set my duffel down and placed the toolbox beside it. My whole body ached from the walk, from the days behind me, from the uncertainty ahead. I sat on the floor and leaned back against the wall, closing my eyes just long enough to breathe. This wasn't salvation. It wasn't even security. But it was mine, bought with what little I had left. And for the first time since Caleb shut that door, I allowed myself to believe that losing everything might not be the end of my story, only the beginning of understanding what had truly been taken from me. The first night on that property was quiet in a way I hadn't heard before. Not peaceful quiet, empty quiet. The kind where every sound stands alone and you become aware of how exposed you are to it. The metal siding creaked as it cooled from the day's heat. Somewhere outside, something skittered through scrap piles, knocking loose bits of rusted sheet metal that clattered against the dirt. I sat on the floor of the trailer with my back against the wall and watched the light fade through a window that had more cracks than glass. I didn't unpack right away. I kept the duffel beside me and rested one hand on the toolbox. That box had weight, and weight meant something solid still existed in my life. I told myself I would lie down once the air cooled, but exhaustion came before planning. I stretched out on the bare floor, using the bag under my head, and closed my eyes. Morning arrived harsh and bright. Sunlight forced its way through the broken window and landed directly across my face. My body protested when I sat up. My joints were stiff, my shoulders sore, my throat dry. I reached for the last of the water and drank carefully, leaving a swallow or two behind out of habit more than logic. Outside, the property looked even more defeated in daylight. I walked slowly, taking inventory. 4 trailers, all in varying states of collapse. One large heap of twisted metal that might have been vehicles, once. The skeletal workshop frame, half roof, half open sky. A cracked asphalt area where oil stains had darkened the ground long ago. Nothing living, nothing maintained. Just abandonment, left behind by time and heat. I found a rusted folding chair near the workshop and dragged it into the shade of the trailer. I sat there with the scrap of paper showing the property description in my hand, rereading words that confirmed ownership. It didn't feel real yet. Owning something doesn't automatically make it useful. It just gives you responsibility. Hunger came again. I ate the last of the bread and tried not to think past the next few hours. Instead, I focused on what I could control: shelter, water, order. Inside the trailer, I cleared a space by pushing aside debris with my boot. Broken plastic, old insulation, fragments of drywall. I swept the dust into a corner using a piece of cardboard. My movements were slow but steady. Small progress steadied my thoughts. By midday, I had enough space to lay my things down without feeling buried in someone else's neglect. The heat rose again as the sun climbed. Sweat soaked through my shirt. I took breaks often, sitting in the shade, rubbing my hands to keep the stiffness from locking them. I opened the toolbox and began sorting through it, not because I needed tools yet, but because familiarity helps anchor you. Wrenches, screwdrivers, pliers, a tape measure, a small hammer with a worn grip. I arranged them on the floor and placed them back in careful order. That afternoon, I walked along the edge of the property and discovered a small outbuilding I hadn't noticed before. The door hung crooked, but opened when I pushed it. Inside were shelves lined with rusted parts, lengths of wire, and several containers that might once have held water or fuel. I shook one, empty. Still, the structure itself offered shade and storage potential. I closed the door behind me and made a note to return later. As evening approached, the temperature eased. I ventured farther along the road toward town, carrying nothing but the wallet in my pocket, and my resolve not to return empty-handed. A gas station stood 2 miles away. The walk strained my knees, but I made it. I bought a cheap sandwich and a gallon jug of water with the last of my money. The cashier asked if I wanted a receipt. I shook my head and carried the supplies back under the fading light. That night I drank deeply, ate slowly, and lay on the cleared patch of floor. My stomach stopped complaining, and that alone allowed sleep to come faster. The darkness settled around me, and I listened again to the metal shifting and the distant desert sounds. This time I wasn't just passing through. This was where I would wake again. Days began to form a rhythm. Mornings spent clearing debris and organizing scrap into piles. Afternoons searching the outbuildings and trailers for anything salvageable. Evenings, resting, eating, thinking. I found pieces of sheet metal I could lean against broken sections of wall to block wind. I discovered a length of rope and used it to secure a loose door panel. None of it was permanent, but it was improvement. On the 4th day, I hauled a collection of copper wiring and aluminum fragments into town in a borrowed grocery cart someone had abandoned behind the gas station. A recycling yard paid me enough to buy canned soup, more bread, and another water jug. The exchange was brief and unremarkable. Money for metal, effort for sustenance. I returned with my shoulders aching and my confidence slightly steadier. Late one afternoon, as I sorted scrap near the workshop frame, a pickup truck slowed on the dirt road. It didn't stop at first, just rolled past, then backed up until it idled near the entrance. A man about my age stepped out, wearing a grease-stained cap and a shirt faded from years in the sun. "You the one staying here?" he asked. "I am." He looked around, taking in the piles I'd organized, the cleared path to the trailer door. "Place hasn't seen that kind of attention in years." I nodded. He introduced himself as Ray and told me he ran a small repair operation down the road. He'd heard someone bought the lot and wanted to see for himself. There was no hostility in his tone, just curiosity. We spoke for a few minutes about weather, about scrap values, about engines he'd fixed and ones he'd given up on. Before leaving, he pointed toward a water spigot behind the workshop. "Line's dead most of the time," he said, "but if the county runs pressure through, you might catch something. Worth checking." After he drove away, I walked back there and twisted the valve. Nothing came out. Still, the possibility itself felt like opportunity. That evening, I sat outside the trailer and watched the sky deepen into color. Purple and orange stretched over flat land that seemed endless. I thought about Caleb again, about the house, about the envelope tucked in my duffel that I still hadn't opened. I knew answers waited inside it. I also knew answers can shift your footing. I went inside and lay down without looking at the envelope yet. The desert air cooled around me, and I let my body rest. I had a place to wake again, something to work on, and just enough momentum to keep from feeling lost. Somewhere beyond the property line, a vehicle passed, headlights sweeping briefly across the metal walls. I watched the light move and fade. In that moment, surrounded by scrap and silence, I understood that rebuilding this place would take time, strength, and patience. But more than that, it would reveal whether I still had the capacity to rebuild myself, and whether what had been taken from me could ever truly be returned. The work settled into me before I realized it had. Not in some grand, purposeful way, just quietly, the same way routine used to form when I was teaching. Wake up, move, fix what you can, accept what you can't. I began rising with the sun because the early hours were the only time the desert showed any mercy. By 10 in the morning, the heat thickened enough to make every movement feel heavier than it should. I started with the workshop frame. It was the largest structure on the property and the one with the most potential. Half of the corrugated roof still clung to its beams, and the concrete floor beneath it was mostly intact. I cleared debris piece by piece, dragging out broken panels, stacking bent metal, sorting wires from garbage. My hands blistered despite the gloves I found in one of the trailers. By the third day, the blisters had hardened into calluses, and I stopped noticing them. Each small improvement mattered. I leaned salvaged panels against the frame to create shade. I nailed warped boards across gaps where wind pushed through. I found an old wooden crate and turned it into a table. When I stepped back at the end of those days, nothing looked transformed, but something felt claimed. The place was beginning to answer to effort. Water remained my constant concern. Every morning I checked the spigot Ray mentioned. Every morning it coughed dust or nothing at all. I rationed what I carried from town, planning trips carefully. Walking there and back under the sun drained more energy than I liked admitting, but carrying those jugs home gave structure to my days. The scrap runs became easier. I learned which metals brought better value and how to spot copper beneath grime. I loaded what I could into the cart and pushed it down the road, resting when my knees insisted. The yard clerks started recognizing me. They didn't ask questions. They weighed what I brought, handed over small bills, and nodded. Transactions like that restore a kind of dignity, effort acknowledged, existence confirmed. One afternoon, while sorting through a heap near the workshop, I uncovered an engine block partially buried under twisted frame pieces. It wasn't salvageable as a machine, but the parts attached to it were intact. I spent hours loosening bolts and freeing components, my muscles aching as the sun dipped lower. When I finished, I carried the pieces inside and lined them on my makeshift table, wiping grease from my hands with a rag that used to be a shirt. I didn't notice Ray's truck pull in until the engine cut. He stepped out and watched me for a moment before speaking. "You ever fix engines professionally?" "I taught it," I said. "High school shop classes." He nodded slowly. "Thought so. You've got the posture." We talked while the air cooled, leaning against opposite sides of the workshop frame. He mentioned a small generator he couldn't get running and asked if I'd take a look. I agreed, more grateful for the chance than I let show. The next morning he brought it over, and I spent hours cleaning contacts, adjusting wiring, and coaxing it back to life. When the engine finally sputtered and held steady, Ray handed me $40 without hesitation. That money bought canned food, a second jug of water, and a used tarp from a roadside vendor. The tarp changed everything. I stretched it across the weakest section of the workshop roof and secured it with rope and bricks. Shade doubled. Air moved differently beneath it. For the first time, I had a place where heat didn't press directly onto my skull. Days stacked into weeks. My body adapted to the strain. I grew stronger in ways I hadn't expected. My back still complained, and my fingers still stiffened at night, but I could lift more, walk farther, think clearer. I set up a corner in the workshop for sleeping when the trailer felt too confining. The open structure let breezes pass through, and I slept better, listening to wind move instead of metal settling. Occasionally, Ray stopped by with small tasks. A mower blade sharpened, a carburetor adjusted. Payment varied cash, a bag of groceries once, a box of old tools another time. Those tools joined mine, expanding what I could offer. Words spread in the quiet way rural places communicate. Another neighbor arrived, needing help with a stalled truck, then another with a broken trailer hitch. Each job small, each payment modest, but together they formed momentum. Evenings became reflective. I'd sit on an overturned bucket, watching the sky shift color while eating whatever meal I'd managed that day. I thought about Marlene often during those hours, about promises, and about whether she would recognize the life I was building now. I also thought about Caleb, though less with anger than with curiosity. I replayed moments, conversations, and the envelope in my duffel that remained unopened. It weighed on me without moving. One evening, while rearranging items inside the trailer, I found the envelope again. I turned it over in my hands. My name was written in Caleb's handwriting, neat, controlled. I considered opening it then, but set it aside once more. I wasn't ready to trade uncertainty for confirmation, not yet. The following week brought a new challenge. A windstorm rolled through, harsh and sudden. Panels rattled. Dust tore across the property. I secured what I could and waited it out inside the trailer. By morning, several makeshift barriers had shifted, and debris scattered again. I walked the perimeter, resetting what I'd built. The work felt heavier that day, but rebuilding reinforced a lesson I was beginning to accept. Nothing here stayed fixed unless I kept fixing it. That afternoon, as I carried scrap toward the sorting piles, I noticed tire tracks leading into the property that hadn't been there before. A sedan approached slowly, stopping near the workshop. A young couple stepped out, apologizing for the intrusion. Their car had overheated, and they'd seen my setup from the road. I checked the radiator, patched a hose temporarily, and sent them off with instructions. They insisted on paying me. I took the cash and watched their taillights disappear. It struck me then that this place, once abandoned, had begun serving a purpose. People came not because it looked promising, but because effort was visible, because work attracts work. That realization settled warmly in my chest. As night came on, I cleaned my tools and set them back in order. I stepped outside and looked across the property, at trailers still leaning, at scrap still waiting, at the workshop standing a little stronger than before. I understood the transformation wasn't dramatic or fast. It was incremental, persistent. I returned inside and lay down, exhaustion pulling me under quickly. In the quiet before sleep, one thought stayed with me. Rebuilding the yard was teaching me patience. And patience, I sensed, would be necessary for something beyond survival, something tied to the envelope I kept avoiding and the truth it held about why I had been cast out in the first place. By the time the second month settled in, the property no longer felt like something I was passing through. It felt inhabited. Not comfortable, not finished, but occupied with intention. I woke before sunrise most mornings, stepping out into air that carried a trace of cool before heat claimed the land again. I would walk the perimeter first, checking what had shifted overnight, tightening rope, repositioning panels, clearing whatever dust or debris had blown in. That ritual grounded me. It reminded me that progress wasn't measured in leaps, only in what I maintained. The workshop became my center. I cleared enough space to park small jobs beneath the tarp, and I arranged my tools across a line of salvaged shelving. Everything had its place, wrenches sorted by size, screwdrivers upright in a rusted coffee can, rags folded. That order gave me calm I hadn't felt since before Marlene died. Teaching had been like that too, organizing chaos into something usable, watching people improve because you showed them how. Ray stopped by often enough that I began expecting the low hum of his truck in the afternoons. He never lingered long, just brought small repairs or news about parts prices. One day he handed me a cooler filled with sandwiches his wife had packed. I tried to refuse, but he waved it off. "You're doing good work out here," he said. "No sense starving while you do it." I accepted, because pride feeds nothing. That night, I ate better than I had in weeks, and the gratitude sat heavy in my chest. Word spread further. A rancher from down the road arrived, needing help with a generator. A delivery driver stopped in after hearing about my repairs. The jobs weren't steady, but they were real. Cash gathered slowly in my pocket. Enough to buy sturdier gloves, more canned goods, even a used lantern that made nights less dependent on fading light. As interactions increased, something shifted inside me. I spoke more. I listened more. People asked questions about my background, and I answered without oversharing. Retired teacher, mechanic by trade, starting over. Most nodded without probing further. In places like this, explanations are accepted at face value. Everyone has a reason for being where they are. One afternoon, while tuning a mower engine, I noticed the mail truck slowing near the road. It passed without stopping, then returned minutes later. The driver leaned out, squinting toward the workshop. "You Frank Hollis?" he called. I stood and wiped my hands. "Yes." He walked over, holding 2 envelopes, forwarded from Phoenix. "Didn't expect anyone to be receiving mail out here." I took them. Official envelopes. Heavy paper. My name printed clearly. I thanked him and watched the truck disappear in a swirl of dust. The letters felt heavier than their weight justified. I set them on the workbench and stared at them while finishing the mower job. My mind wandered back to the envelope in my duffel, the one I'd avoided opening. 3 pieces of unanswered truth sitting within reach. I carried the new letters inside the trailer and placed them beside the old one. I didn't open them yet. Instead, I made dinner, rinsed grease from my hands, and sat quietly while dusk settled. There's a point in the evening when light fades just enough that everything feels suspended. I stayed in that moment longer than usual, listening to the wind brushing against the tarp above the workshop. Eventually, curiosity outweighed delay. I opened the first envelope carefully. Inside were documents from a financial institution. Language, formal and cold. Statements indicating accounts transferred and closed. I read each line twice, slower each time. My pulse shifted, tightening in my chest. The second envelope confirmed changes to property titles, authorizations executed in my name but signed through representation. I sat still after finishing them, papers resting on my knees. The words were clear even if the details weren't. Decisions had been made about my assets, changes enacted without my direct involvement. My thoughts circled the same point. Caleb had insisted on managing paperwork months ago. He'd said it was easier that way. I folded the letters and set them aside. I didn't reach for the final unopened envelope yet. Instead, I stepped outside, breathing in air that had cooled enough to steady me. I walked the yard slowly, past scrap piles and trailers, grounding myself in physical space before confronting abstract betrayal. Sleep came lightly that night. I woke early and returned to work, burying questions beneath motion, sorting metal, repairing tools, preparing parts for a job Ray promised would come later that week. Physical effort quieted mental noise, if only temporarily. The following afternoon, a pickup pulled in carrying a family whose sedan had failed miles back. Steam billowed from the hood. I diagnosed the issue, replaced a cracked hose with salvaged material, and filled the radiator from my reserves. They insisted on paying generously and offered thanks that lingered in their tone. Watching them drive away, relief evident in their posture, reminded me how useful I still was. That usefulness mattered. Later, sitting at my makeshift table, I looked again at the unopened envelope. I picked it up and weighed it in my hands. paper shouldn't hold power, but it does when it contains decisions made about your life. I slid my finger beneath the seal and opened it. Inside were copies of authorization forms granting financial authority to Caleb. My signature appeared, but the surrounding text revealed more than I remembered agreeing to. Expanded permissions. Control over assets and legal standing beyond simple assistance. I read until the words blurred, then read again. The realization wasn't explosive. It didn't arrive as anger. It arrived as understanding. Quiet, cold, methodical. The eviction, the distance, the documents all connected. A pattern rather than an accident. I folded the papers neatly and placed them back into their envelope. Then I set all 3 letters together inside my toolbox. Not hidden, stored. Evidence waiting for clarity. That evening I worked longer than usual, adjusting a carburetor under lantern light, hands steady despite thoughts circling behind them. The desert stretched silent around me, stars bright overhead. I realized that what I'd built here had given me something essential. Stability, perspective, the strength to see truth without collapsing beneath it. I locked the toolbox and stepped back into the trailer to sleep. My body ached pleasantly from effort, and my mind settled into resolve. The work I'd begun on this land had restored more than income. It had restored enough of myself to confront what those papers implied. And I knew that eventually I would follow those implications wherever they led, because understanding what had been taken from me was the next repair I needed to make. I didn't open the toolbox again for 2 days after reading those documents. I kept it closed, latched, and set in its usual place beside the workbench, as if distance might make what I'd learned settle into something easier to carry. Instead, I worked. Work had always been the one reliable way to quiet my thoughts. When you're focused on torque specs and wiring diagrams, there's no space left for doubt or memory. Those 2 days were full. Ray dropped off a pressure washer engine that refused to turn over. A rancher brought in a cracked axle mount that needed welding. I spent hours shaping metal and tightening bolts, my hands steady, my mind disciplined. But beneath every motion sat the awareness that something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't just rebuilding a place anymore. I was beginning to understand I'd been dismantled somewhere else. On the 3rd morning, I unlocked the toolbox and spread the letters across the table again. This time I read them slower, searching for specifics instead of impressions. Account closures. Transfers authorized under durable power of attorney language. Asset liquidation entries tied to dates I remembered as ordinary afternoons spent watching television in Caleb's living room. A line noting property disposition following medical status determination. That phrase caught me. Medical status determination. I read further. A reference number led to another document included in the packet. I unfolded it carefully. Clinical assessment language. Formal and distant. It stated I had been evaluated for cognitive decline. It declared diminished capacity to manage financial affairs. It recommended legal oversight. I sat still for a long time after finishing. I remembered no such evaluation, no appointment, no conversation. The memory gap wasn't subtle. It was absolute. I stood up and walked outside, breathing hard through my nose, letting heat and sunlight press against my skin. The yard looked as it always did. Scrap piles, workshop, dust shifting with the breeze. Reality unchanged. But inside me, something cracked open. Not loudly, quietly. The kind of break that doesn't echo but alters the structure. I returned to the table and kept reading. More documentation followed. Sale records connected to my previous home. Retirement account adjustments executed under authorized management. Everything orderly. Legal, filed, approved. Each page told a consistent story. That I had been deemed incapable. That authority had shifted. That decisions were made on my behalf. Decisions that ended with my removal from the only stable residence I'd known since Marlene died. I folded the papers and leaned forward, elbows resting on the table. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. The emotion that arrived wasn't explosive enough for either. It was colder, calculated. Understanding replaced confusion piece by piece. Caleb hadn't simply wanted me gone. He'd prepared the ground long before that night in the kitchen. Documentation shaped perception. Perception shaped authority. Authority shaped outcome. I gathered the papers again and returned them to the toolbox. Then I stepped outside and resumed sorting scrap, forcing my muscles into familiar rhythm. Movement steadied me, but thoughts refused to disperse. Every memory from those last months in Phoenix replayed with new context. Caleb guiding me through signatures. Caleb reassuring me that everything was routine. Caleb maintaining calm certainty. That evening, Ray stopped by and noticed my silence. "You all right?" he asked. "Just tired," I said. He accepted that without pressing. People who work with engines understand that not everything is visible from the outside. He handed me a bag of groceries and left after brief conversation about a job scheduled next week. I watched his truck disappear and appreciated the simplicity of that exchange. No deception, no layered motives, just effort traded for kindness. I slept poorly that night. Dreams arrived fractured, filled with paperwork and locked doors and ceilings spinning backward. When morning came, I rose earlier than usual and drove into town with Ray, who had offered a lift for supply runs. I visited the public records office with copies of the documents in my bag. The clerk behind the counter directed me toward terminals where filings could be reviewed. I navigated menus slowly, fingers stiff on the keyboard, searching reference numbers printed on the letters. Each entry confirmed legitimacy. Signatures witnessed, forms notarized, orders processed. One listing included a scanned physician statement attached to the competency filing. I opened it. My name printed at the top. Assessment details describing confusion and forgetfulness. Observations I didn't recognize. Signature below. I stared at that signature longer than I should have. I couldn't recall meeting the doctor whose name appeared beside it. Couldn't place the clinic. Couldn't trace the appointment in memory. That absence spoke louder than accusation. I left the building, carrying printed copies, and stepped into sunlight that felt harsher than before. Ray waited by the truck, asking nothing when I climbed in. The ride back passed mostly in silence. I appreciated that silence more than conversation. Back at the property, I placed the new papers beside the others. The stack was growing. Evidence, if that's what it would become. Or confirmation, if nothing else. Work resumed. A carburetor rebuild. A trailer hitch reinforcement. Tasks filled hours, but reflection threaded through each movement. I understood now the scale of what had happened. My displacement hadn't been spontaneous. It had been structured, planned with documentation as foundation. As dusk fell, I sat on the bucket near the workshop and watched the sky darken. The desert held its usual stillness. Crickets began their steady chorus. I thought about confronting Caleb immediately, about demanding explanation. But impulse rarely repairs damage. Repair requires patience, preparation. I stood and carried the toolbox inside, setting it beside where I slept. Those papers represented more than betrayal. They represented a path forward, though I didn't yet know its shape. Understanding what had been taken was the first step. Deciding what to do with that understanding would come later. I lay down, staring at the ceiling, while night settled fully. The events that led me here were no longer unclear. I saw them with precision now, and in that clarity, a quiet resolve formed. Not fueled by rage, not driven by revenge, driven by the simple conviction that truth, once uncovered, demands acknowledgement. And someday, I intended to give that truth a voice strong enough to be heard beyond this stretch of desert. For several days after that visit to the records office, I moved through my routines without feeling present inside them. My body worked, but my mind stayed elsewhere, circling the same quiet realization. I had not been pushed aside out of inconvenience. I had been repositioned, managed, legally redefined by paperwork I barely remembered touching. That knowledge didn't ignite anger the way some stories might expect. It hollowed something out first. The mornings became harder to start. I still woke early, but I sat longer before standing. The yard looked unchanged, yet it felt unfamiliar, as though I were seeing it from behind glass. I sorted scrap slower. Tools felt heavier. Even the sound of metal striking metal lost its rhythm. Ray noticed before I acknowledged it myself. "You've been missing bolts," he said one afternoon, watching me misplace a socket I had just used. "I'll find it," I answered. He crouched beside the workbench and rested his forearms on his knees. "You don't usually lose focus like that." I wiped my hands on a rag and leaned back against the table. The words surfaced before I planned them. I found out why I was forced out. It wasn't just a decision, it was arranged. Ray didn't interrupt. He waited. They filed paperwork claiming I couldn't manage my own affairs. Used it to sell off what I had. Close accounts, transfer control. He nodded slowly, absorbing rather than reacting. "That's a heavy thing. I don't even remember the evaluation they used." Ray stood and brushed his hands on his jeans. "You planning to act on it?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "Part of me wants to let it stay behind me. Another part says, if I ignore it, I'm agreeing with it." He left me with that thought, returning to his truck without pushing further. The quiet after he drove off felt deeper than before. I sat alone with the sound of wind brushing the tarp overhead, letting the question settle. That night, I didn't eat much. I stared at the letters spread across the table again, tracing the printed language with my eyes until the lines blurred. The documentation had power. It could erase someone with enough signatures, but it also held traceable paths. I saw that now. Reference numbers, offices, names. Still, the weight of confronting it pressed down on me. Fighting something structured and legal seemed larger than I was prepared for. I lay down early, hoping sleep might loosen the knot in my chest. Instead, I woke repeatedly, replaying memories that no longer fit comfortably in their old places. The next morning, I didn't rise at dawn. I stayed lying there, staring upward while heat crept into the trailer. Eventually, I sat up and wrapped my arms around my knees. The desert outside waited, but I hesitated. For the first time since arriving, the idea of continuing without direction felt overwhelming. By midday, Glenda appeared. I hadn't met her before, though Ray mentioned neighbors in passing. She stepped out of her truck, carrying a basket, and approached with measured calm. "Heard you fixed my brother's tractor line," she said. "Figured I'd bring thanks." Inside the basket were fresh tortillas, beans, and a thermos of coffee. I invited her to sit in the workshop shade. We talked about nothing urgent. Weather, fuel prices, small-town rumors. Eventually, she studied me with a quiet steadiness. "You look like someone carrying more than scrap metal," she said. I hesitated, then spoke. "Not everything, but enough. The papers, the declarations, the realization." She listened without interruption. When I finished, she leaned back and folded her hands. "Let me tell you something," she said. "You didn't come all this way, rebuild this place, and survive on stubbornness alone. You did it because you believed your life still had weight. Paper doesn't change that unless you let it." I stared at the concrete floor. "I'm tired of feeling like I'm fighting ghosts." "Then stop fighting ghosts," she said. "Fight facts. If those papers are wrong, you show they're wrong. If they're right, you still decide what comes next. Either way, lying down won't give you peace." She left shortly after, refusing payment and waving off thanks. I stood watching her drive away, the basket empty on the table, and her words settling in slowly. That afternoon I returned to work deliberately. I sorted tools again, tightened fasteners on a repair job waiting for pickup. I focused on each motion, re-establishing rhythm. As the sun lowered, my breathing steadied. Resolve began forming where exhaustion had been. I spent the evening organizing every document into a single folder, chronological order, notations in pencil along margins, names highlighted. I didn't yet know what steps to take, but preparation itself felt like movement. In the following days, I drove into town twice, once to copy records, once to inquire about legal aid services. The receptionist handed me pamphlets and contact numbers. She didn't promise outcomes. She offered process. That was enough. Work on the yard continued between trips. Repairs came in steadily. Payment built modest savings. Physical labor regained its familiar grounding effect. My confidence grew alongside capability. I noticed how differently I carried myself when speaking with customers. Straighter posture, firmer voice, clarity replacing hesitation. One evening, while locking the toolbox, I paused. I realized something important had shifted. The question wasn't whether I would address what happened. It was how and when. The hesitation had faded into planning. I stepped outside and looked across the property. The workshop stood solid beneath its tarp. Scrap piles organized, paths cleared, evidence of persistence visible everywhere I turned. This place reflected what I had rebuilt internally, stability through effort. As darkness settled, I sat in my usual spot and allowed the quiet to surround me. I understood then that breaking down had been necessary. It forced recognition of limits. Rising again forced recognition of strength. I lay down that night, with purpose replacing doubt. There were steps ahead, conversations to initiate, records to challenge. I didn't yet know the full path, but I knew I would follow it. And as sleep came, I accepted one truth clearly. Survival had brought me this far. Action would carry me the rest of the way. The rain came without warning, which was unusual for that stretch of desert. Clouds had gathered low and gray all morning, but storms usually announced themselves with time to prepare. This one didn't. The sky darkened in minutes, and then the wind shifted, sharp and insistent, carrying the first drop sideways across the yard. I was in the workshop adjusting a generator when the sound of thunder cracked so close it rattled the metal panels. I shut the engine down and stepped outside just as the rain turned heavy. Not a gentle fall, but a pounding, drenching rush that flattened dust and turned the dirt road into mud almost instantly. Water streamed off the tarp in uneven sheets. I checked the tie-downs, tightening ropes where they strained, anchoring loose edges with bricks. The air smelled metallic and clean at the same time. Within half an hour, the ground couldn't absorb anymore. Water began pooling and then moving, carving shallow channels that deepened quickly. I watched it cut across the yard toward the lower trailers. I knew then this wasn't just rain. It was a flash flood, the kind that turns dry land dangerous before you realize what's happening. I moved fast, shifting tools and supplies higher, lifting crates onto makeshift platforms. The workshop floor stayed mostly dry, but the trailer sat lower. I waded through rising water to secure the door and pull my duffel onto a shelf. My boots filled with muddy water, and every step felt heavier. That's when I heard shouting. At first it blended with the wind and rain, distant and uneven. Then it sharpened into words. I turned toward the road and saw headlights stuck at an angle, half swallowed by rushing water. A sedan sat crooked in the shallow ditch, its front end submerged, hazard lights blinking weakly through the rain. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed a length of rope from the workshop and ran toward the road, the water pushing hard against my legs. As I got closer, I saw two figures clinging to the car. A woman stood knee-deep in water, holding onto the door, her face panicked. Inside the car, an older man slumped forward, unmoving. "Help!" she shouted when she saw me. "He can't get out." I waded closer, testing each step with the rope looped around my waist. The current pulled at my legs, trying to knock me off balance. When I reached the car, I braced myself against it and leaned inside. The man was conscious but disoriented, his hands weak, his breathing shallow. I smelled gasoline mixed with rain. "We need to move him now," I said. "The water's rising." The woman nodded, eyes wide. Together we pulled him free, his weight heavier than expected as the current pressed against us. I looped the rope around his chest and handed the other end to her, then positioned myself downstream to steady him. Step by step, we moved toward higher ground, muscles burning, rain soaking through every layer of clothing. When we reached the workshop, I guided them inside, setting the man down on a dry section of concrete. I wrapped him in a tarp and checked his pulse, fast but steady, shock mostly. I had the woman sit him upright and keep him talking, while I lit the lantern and closed off windward openings as best I could. The rain raged outside for hours. The water continued to rush past, but the workshop held. We stayed there, listening to thunder roll overhead and rain hammer the tarp. I boiled water on a small camping stove and poured it into a thermos for warmth. The man's color improved slowly. His breathing steadied. They introduced themselves once the worst passed. His name was Walter. He'd been visiting his daughter, Anne, who lived in town. They'd tried to make it back before the storm worsened and misjudged the road. "You saved his life," Anne said quietly, her voice breaking as she watched him drink small sips of water. I shook my head. "We just got lucky." She looked around the workshop, at the tools, the tarp roof, the scrap piles visible through the open side. People said no one lived out here. "I do," I said simply. They stayed until the rain eased near dawn. By then, the floodwater had receded enough to make the road passable again. Before leaving, Anne pressed a folded bill into my hand. I tried to refuse, but she closed my fingers around it firmly. "For the repairs," she said, "and for not letting him drown." After they left, I stood alone in the workshop, soaked, exhausted, and shaking from adrenaline. The yard was a mess, debris scattered, water lines marked how high it had risen, but the structures stood. I'd reinforced them well enough to hold. I spent the morning cleaning up, resetting what the storm disturbed. By midday, Ray pulled in, eyes wide when he saw the condition of the place. "Heard about the flood," he said. "People in town were talking. Said someone pulled a man out of a car out here." I nodded, continuing to stack metal. "Just did what needed doing." Ray watched me for a moment. "You know folks notice things like that." I shrugged. "Didn't do it for notice." But notice came anyway. That evening, a reporter showed up. A local paper, small circulation. He'd heard about the rescue and wanted details. I answered his questions plainly, focusing on the storm and the mechanics of the rescue rather than myself. He took notes, snapped a few photos, and thanked me. The next day, more people stopped by. Some brought supplies, others brought work. The yard felt different, alive in a new way, not just functional, but known. As I worked, I realized something important. The storm hadn't just tested the structures I'd built. It had tested me. In that moment of urgency, I hadn't hesitated. I hadn't questioned my worth or my place. I'd acted because I could, because it was right. That clarity stayed with me as night fell again. Sitting beneath the tarp, listening to the quiet after the storm, I understood that whatever Caleb's papers said, whatever authority they claimed, they couldn't erase what I had proven to myself and to others. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't incapable. And now people beyond this yard knew it too. The attention from that storm didn't fade as quickly as I expected. I woke the next morning to 2 trucks parked near the entrance and a woman standing beside them holding a camera. She introduced herself as Dana, a journalist working freelance for regional outlets. She'd read the small article about the rescue and wanted to hear more about the property and how I ended up there. I hesitated at first. I hadn't planned on telling anyone beyond the basics, but there was something steady in her approach. She asked carefully, listened fully, and didn't interrupt. I told her about teaching auto shop for decades, about Marlene, about moving in with Caleb after she died. I explained the eviction simply, without embellishment. I didn't show her the documents yet. Not then. She left me with her card and a quiet statement. "If there's more to the story," she said, "people deserve to hear it." I carried her card around for 2 days before acting. During that time, I revisited every document again, cross-checking dates, reading notes in margins, reviewing copies from the records office. The structure of what had been done became clearer with repetition. Authority transferred, accounts closed, evaluations filed. Each piece linked to the next like parts in a machine built to run quietly. On the 3rd day, I called her. She arrived that afternoon, recorder in hand. This time I placed the folder on the workbench and let her read. She worked through the papers slowly, occasionally asking clarifying questions. I answered what I could and admitted what I couldn't. By the end, her expression had shifted from curiosity to focus. "This isn't just family conflict," she said. "There may be legal misconduct here, medical misrepresentation, financial exploitation." I nodded. Hearing it framed that way carried weight, not emotion, structure. She asked if she could connect me with someone who specialized in investigative reporting tied to legal cases. I agreed. Within a week, another journalist visited. He approached the situation differently, probing timelines, collecting copies, noting names. He encouraged me to contact legal aid formally and offered guidance on documentation. I followed through. I scheduled a consultation at a legal clinic in town. The attorney assigned to review my case studied the records for nearly an hour before speaking. "You have grounds to challenge this," she said. "If the evaluation occurred without your presence or informed consent, and assets were transferred based on that determination, there could be significant violations." She outlined steps: filing statements, requesting medical records, petitioning review of financial actions. Each process came with timelines and forms. I took notes carefully, writing in the same methodical script I'd used grading assignments for years. Returning to the property that evening, I felt something unfamiliar settle in. Direction, not certainty of outcome, but clarity of path. Over the following weeks, I balanced legal preparation with daily work. I copied documents, mailed requests, filled applications. Between those tasks, I repaired engines and sorted scrap. Customers kept arriving, some referencing the article they'd read. They spoke with respect that felt earned rather than assumed. Dana returned occasionally, updating me on coverage and developments. One afternoon, she told me a larger publication had picked up the story. "You're becoming visible beyond this county," she said. I absorbed that quietly. Visibility wasn't the goal. Resolution was. But attention helped ensure processes weren't ignored. One evening, after finishing paperwork, I sat beneath the workshop tarp and considered how much had changed. Months earlier, I arrived here carrying confusion and displacement. Now I carried evidence and intention. The yard reflected that progression: organized tools, reinforced structures, evidence of care. Soon after, I received confirmation from the attorney that inquiries into the physician's statement were underway. Requests for documentation had been submitted. Financial institutions were responding to record demands. The process moved slowly, but movement itself mattered. The first major response arrived as a letter indicating discrepancies in appointment logs connected to the evaluation. Dates didn't align with clinic records. My presence hadn't been documented. The attorney explained the significance during our next meeting. "This strengthens your case considerably," she said. "If the evaluation lacked proper procedure, subsequent authorizations may be invalid." I left her office carrying copies of that response and a sense of gravity that extended beyond personal vindication. The truth unfolding wasn't emotional, it was factual. And facts accumulate weight. Back at the yard, work continued as usual. Ray stopped by to drop off parts and noticed my lighter mood. "You look steadier," he said. "I am," I replied. "Things are moving," he nodded, satisfied with that. In the following days, calls came from additional reporters requesting comment. I kept my answers measured, focused on events rather than accusations. The goal wasn't spectacle, it was record. One afternoon, while replacing brake lines on a pickup, I realized how seamlessly two parts of my life were now interwoven. Physical rebuilding here, institutional rebuilding elsewhere. Both required patience, precision, and resilience. As autumn edged toward winter, the legal process advanced to formal filing. Documentation was submitted to challenge the determinations made months earlier. Hearing dates were tentatively scheduled. The attorney assured me preparation remained key. That night, I stood outside under a sky clear enough to show every star. The desert felt vast and silent, yet I no longer felt isolated within it. My actions reached beyond this land now, threading into systems designed to record and judge. I walked back inside, locking the toolbox and placing updated folders beside it. Evidence had begun its journey outward. Truth was no longer contained here alone, and as I lay down to sleep, I understood that confrontation was no longer hypothetical. It was approaching, structured and inevitable, carried forward by persistence I had rebuilt piece by piece, in the shadow of rusted metal and open sky. The notice for the hearing arrived in a plain envelope. Folded among the rest of the mail, the driver handed me one cool morning. I stood in the workshop doorway, sunlight just beginning to spill across the concrete floor, and opened it without ceremony. The language was formal, structured, and final in tone. A date, a time, a courthouse address back in Phoenix, a request for my presence and documentation related to the petition challenging prior determinations and financial actions. I read it twice, then placed it on the table beside my tools. For months I had been building toward this moment in slow increments. Now it had shape. Preparing to leave the yard, even briefly, required more thought than I expected. I arranged current repair jobs by priority, notified Ray, and secured what materials could be exposed in my absence. He insisted on checking in daily while I was gone. "You've got enough to think about," he said. "I'll keep an eye on things." I packed my duffel with clothes that were clean but worn, folded the documents carefully into a rigid folder, and placed them inside my toolbox for transport. That box had carried my trade. Now it carried my history. The drive back to Phoenix felt different from my arrival months earlier. Then, I had come without direction. Now I returned with purpose. The landscape changed gradually, from open desert to denser roads, structures multiplying, traffic thickening. Memories resurfaced as familiar landmarks passed. I didn't resist them. I let them come and go. The courthouse stood exactly as I remembered: stone and glass, impersonal and steady. Inside, fluorescent lighting hummed overhead, and footsteps echoed on polished floors. I checked in and waited, seated among others absorbed in their own proceedings. I held my folder in my lap and watched the door until my name was called. The hearing room was smaller than I imagined. A judge presided at the front, calm and attentive. My attorney stood beside me, guiding where needed. Caleb sat across the room with his counsel, posture rigid, expression carefully neutral. Seeing him stirred no surge of emotion, just recognition. Proceedings began with procedural review. My attorney presented documentation, outlining discrepancies in the medical assessment and financial authorizations. Evidence of missing appointment records. Evidence of irregularities in signatures and filings. The judge listened, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Caleb's counsel responded with their own interpretation, emphasizing reliance on documentation at the time. The exchange remained measured, legal language replacing personal confrontation. I spoke when prompted, answering clearly about my recollection and involvement. At one point, the physician whose name appeared on the original evaluation was referenced through submitted statements. Records indicated administrative handling errors and incomplete procedural verification. The phrasing remained technical, but the implication was evident. Hours passed before the judge recessed briefly. When proceedings resumed, preliminary findings were summarized. Determinations based on the challenged evaluation would undergo formal review. Financial transactions executed under that authority were subject to investigation and potential reversal, depending on outcome. Further hearings would follow. It wasn't resolution yet. It was acknowledgement, recognition that the situation warranted correction. Outside the courtroom, Caleb approached cautiously. We stood facing one another in the corridor, people passing by unaware of history suspended between us. "I acted based on what I was told," he said quietly. I looked at him, measuring tone rather than words. "You acted without asking me." Silence lingered. He didn't argue further. Neither did I. There were no raised voices, just two people standing on opposite sides of consequence. I returned to Yuma that evening, exhausted in a way different from physical labor. The yard greeted me unchanged, its stillness grounding. Ray waved from across the lot, satisfied to see me back. I unpacked, replaced documents in the toolbox, and sat outside as dusk settled. Over the next weeks, updates arrived steadily. Investigations confirmed procedural faults in the evaluation process. Financial institutions began reviewing account transfers. Interim orders restored limited access pending final determination. Each notice carried incremental correction. Work continued alongside it all, repairs, scrap sorting, customer visits. The routine remained intact, anchoring me through the legal unfolding. Neighbors stopped by with encouragement. Dana checked in periodically, documenting progress. Coverage expanded carefully, keeping focus on systemic lessons rather than spectacle. The final hearing occurred months later. This time, conclusions were definitive. Authority granted under the flawed evaluation was revoked. Transactions executed under that authority required restitution adjustments. Administrative errors were formally acknowledged. The judge's closing remarks emphasized accountability and procedural diligence. Standing there, I felt neither triumph nor bitterness, only completion of a chapter that demanded endurance. Outside, reporters asked questions. I answered simply. It wasn't about winning, I said. It was about being seen accurately. Returning home once more, I stepped into the workshop and set my toolbox down in its familiar place. The yard stretched before me, stable and honest in its imperfections. I resumed work the next morning as usual, tightening bolts and checking connections, allowing the rhythm of effort to settle everything that remained unsettled. The process had restored more than records. It restored alignment between who I was and how I existed in the world's documentation. And as I watched the sun dip behind distant hills that evening, I understood that justice sometimes arrives not with celebration, but with quiet correction, fitting reality back into place, one verified fact at a time. Life did not change overnight after the hearings ended. There was no dramatic shift, no sudden sense that everything had been restored. The yard still needed tending, engines still broke down, metal still rusted in the sun. I woke at the same hour and walked the same perimeter each morning, tightening what had loosened and stacking what had shifted. Stability, I had learned, came from repetition, not declarations. But something internal had settled. The letters that once sat heavy in my toolbox were now archived records rather than unresolved threats. The court's orders had begun their slow effect. Financial institutions processed adjustments. A portion of the assets that had been moved under the old authority returned through measured transfers. It wasn't full restoration, and I didn't expect it to be. Time erodes more than numbers. Still, acknowledgement mattered. Caleb and I did not speak again after that hallway exchange. The distance remained. I didn't chase reconciliation. Some relationships require silence to heal, or to conclude. I focused instead on what remained present and workable. Winter approached gently in the desert. Nights cooled enough to make the workshop tarp snap quietly in the wind. I added reinforcements where needed, sealing edges, stacking scrap in protective rows. Customers continued arriving. Repairs grew more consistent as word spread beyond neighboring roads. I kept a ledger now, tracking jobs and income with careful handwriting. The act of recording felt grounding, measured progress, written in ink. One afternoon, while sorting through a newly delivered load of scrap from Ray, I uncovered something unusual, buried beneath twisted panels and rusted frames. At first glance, it looked like any other neglected object, dust-coated and dented. But when I brushed debris aside, the shape resolved into something distinct, the curve of polished chrome beneath corrosion, the outline of a hood ornament partially intact. I cleared more material carefully. Underneath lay the shell of an old vehicle, not recent enough to be junkyard common. Its lines were classic, proportions elegant even under decay. Curiosity replaced routine. I spent the remainder of the afternoon uncovering it piece by piece, revealing faded paint and intact structural integrity beneath superficial damage. Ray stopped by just as I finished clearing the frame. He whistled softly. "That's not scrap," he said. "That's a vintage chassis. Mid-century, maybe earlier." We examined markings stamped along the engine compartment, serial numbers etched clearly despite rust. Ray recognized enough to suggest deeper value than I anticipated. "You should check this," he said. "Collectors pay for restorations like that." The discovery altered my focus for days. I researched identification numbers through online archives at the library, cross-referenced databases, confirmed year and model classification. The results surprised me. The vehicle wasn't merely old, it was rare. A limited production build once sought by enthusiasts. I stood in the workshop that evening, lantern casting light across the metal curves, and considered the irony. Months earlier, I had purchased the property believing it held only survival potential. Now it revealed something entirely different. Hidden worth concealed beneath layers of neglect. Restoration would take time, skill, resources, but possibility alone shifted perspective. I began dismantling sections carefully, cataloging parts, planning reconstruction phases. The process engaged me fully. It connected patience, craftsmanship, and foresight in a way that mirrored my own experience rebuilding life here. Dana visited during this period and documented the find, intrigued by the symbolism. She remarked on how often overlooked places hide overlooked value. I didn't disagree. As weeks passed, I committed to restoring the vehicle gradually between regular work, sanding corrosion, repairing fittings, sourcing missing components through contacts Ray helped identify. The effort attracted interest from collectors who heard through local channels. Offers arrived early, but I declined. Completion mattered more than quick exchange. Spring returned with warmer air and longer light. The yard looked different now, less chaotic, more structured. The restored sections of the car gleamed where I'd polished metal back to life. Customers commented on it frequently, some lingering to watch progress. One evening, while tightening newly fitted mounts beneath the chassis, I paused and looked across the property. I remembered arriving with $11 and uncertainty. I remembered nights spent sleeping on bare flooring. I remembered the weight of documents claiming incapacity. Each memory contrasted sharply with the present view. The restoration project reached functional completion months later. The engine ran smooth after tuning. Exterior surfaces held renewed finish. I drove it slowly along the dirt road for the first time, listening to the steady rhythm of machinery responding correctly to care. That drive marked more than mechanical success. It marked realization. Offers increased after that. One collector proposed a sum far exceeding any financial restitution received from court proceedings. I considered briefly before accepting. The sale provided resources beyond expectation. Enough to expand the workshop, enough to install permanent roofing, enough to secure long-term water access. As funds cleared and improvements began, I reflected on the sequence of events leading here. Loss, displacement, discovery, correction, opportunity. None of it aligned with initial belief. The yard that once represented survival had become foundation for something sustainable. On the evening the upgraded workshop lights switched on for the first time, illuminating the entire space with steady brightness, I stood quietly beneath them. I understood then that the greatest twist in my journey was not legal vindication or restored accounts. It was uncovering worth where I expected none. I locked the toolbox and turned toward the open yard. The desert stretched beyond, unchanged yet different in how I saw it. I realized everything I believed to be lost had not vanished. It had transformed, waiting beneath surface neglect for patient hands to reveal it. And as I walked back inside, I carried that understanding forward, ready for whatever quiet truths remained hidden beyond the horizon. Spring turned to summer again before I noticed how long I had been standing still and simply living, not surviving, not recovering, not fighting paperwork or hauling scrap to stay fed. Living. The workshop roof held firm through heat and wind, permanent beams replacing the patched tarp. The waterline installation Ray helped coordinate gave the property a steady supply that no longer required daily trips. Electricity followed months later, and the first night the lights flicked on across the entire yard felt quieter than I expected, almost reverent. Routine became something softer. I still rose early, walked the boundary, checked fasteners, sorted incoming jobs, but I moved with the steadiness of someone who no longer wondered if tomorrow would exist. Customers came and went. Some stayed to talk longer than needed. A few brought their children just to show them how tools worked. I found myself teaching again, not in a classroom but beneath open sky, explaining torque patterns and engine timing while small hands held flashlights. The ledger grew thicker, Income stabilized. The sale of the restored car had allowed improvements I once considered impossible. I expanded the workspace, added shelving, and built a small office inside the least damaged trailer. It held a desk, a chair, and a cabinet where my documents stayed organized. The letters that once shook me rested there now among invoices and permits, part of history rather than present tension. Occasionally, I received updates tied to the legal aftermath. Administrative corrections finalized. Restitution closed. Notifications arrived without ceremony, each one confirming that chapter had ended properly. I filed them away, neither celebrating nor dwelling on them. Justice had been acknowledged. Life continued. Caleb reached out once by letter months later. His handwriting was familiar, the phrasing cautious. He expressed regret for harm caused and confusion over decisions made under advice he trusted at the time. I read it through slowly, folded it, and placed it in the cabinet. I didn't respond immediately. Forgiveness and reconciliation follow different timelines. Some require distance before clarity. One evening, while sitting on a chair near the workshop entrance, I watched twilight settle across the yard. A warm breeze carried the scent of oil and metal. Ray pulled up and joined me, handing over a cold drink. "You've built something here," he said. "We all did," I replied. He nodded, accepting shared credit without debate. That was his way. We sat quietly, the sound of insects rising as darkness fell. The lights I'd installed cast steady circles across the ground, illuminating the space where I once sorted scrap in shadow. After he left, I walked slowly across the property. I passed the trailers that still leaned but no longer threatened collapse. I touched the metal frame of the workshop, remembering the first day I stepped inside it uncertain and empty-handed. I stopped near the road and looked outward, headlights from distant cars moving along the horizon. I thought about power, not the kind measured in authority or paperwork, the kind measured in resilience, in persistence, in the quiet refusal to accept a definition written by someone else. Family had once meant proximity and shared walls. Now I understood it differently. Family could be anyone who showed up when the wind rose, who handed you tools, who respected your work. Hidden truth had shaped my path more than once. The truth about those documents, the truth about what lay buried in scrap, the truth about my own capacity to begin again when certainty disappeared. None of it announced itself loudly. It emerged slowly, uncovered through attention and patience. Years later, when visitors occasionally asked how I ended up here, I told them plainly. I spoke about being forced out, about finding opportunity where none was promised, about learning that losing control doesn't mean losing worth. They listened, some with surprise, some with recognition. One night, after closing up, I left the workshop lights on longer than necessary and stood watching them glow through the open door. I kept them lit now, partly for visibility, partly as habit, partly because I remembered nights when darkness felt absolute. Light became a quiet signal to anyone passing by that someone remained here, working, steady. I returned inside and sat at the desk, opening my ledger. I recorded the day's jobs, added notes about upcoming repairs, and closed the book carefully. The motion felt ceremonial, marking completion without finality. Before turning in, I stepped outside once more. The sky was clear, stars sharp and constant above the desert. I thought about the path behind me, the confusion, the endurance, the resolution. I thought about the path ahead, unwritten and open. If someone asked what I learned from losing everything, I would answer simply, power isn't held in documents or property. It's held in persistence. Family isn't guaranteed by names. It's built by presence. Hidden truths don't stay buried forever. They reveal themselves when you keep moving forward. I switched off the yard lights one by one until only the workshop lamp remained. Its glow reached the road, soft and steady. And I left it on, not just for me, but for anyone traveling in darkness who needed proof that starting over was still possible.